Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we're jumping into some C.S. Lewis to clear up a huge misunderstanding about Christian morality. A lot of people, both inside and outside the church, think Christianity is pretty much all about sexual ethics. Well, according to Lewis, that view gets things completely backward. Right. And let's just put Lewis's own words right up front. He says, if anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. This is really the whole point we're unpacking today. Lewis saw that people were getting this wrong, and he wanted to set the record straight on what sin is really all about. And that's because, for Lewis, the heart of Christian morality isn't about sex at all. Now, sins of the flesh are still sins, no doubt about it, but they aren't the main event. Lewis says the real spiritual war is fought over sins that are, as he puts it, purely spiritual. Okay, so if the big deal isn't sins of the flesh, then what is it? Well, this gets us to Lewis's idea of the real enemy, the one inside of us. He believed there are these two competing forces within a person, and you have to get a handle on them to understand his view on sin. He calls these two forces the animal self and the diabolical self. Pretty straightforward, right? The animal self is tied to our bodies, our appetites, things like unchastity. But the diabolical self, that's connected to those purely spiritual sins. And Lewis could not be clearer on this point. The diabolical self is far, far worse. And here's what he's talking about. The worst pleasures, the ones that feed that diabolical self, have zero to do with our bodies. It's stuff like the satisfaction you get from putting someone else in their place, or bossing people around, or gossiping and backbiting. And of course, the raw pleasure that comes from having power over others, or even just from hating them. These are the sins Lewis says are the most serious. Which brings us to this statement, and it's a bombshell for a lot of folks. Lewis actually concludes that sins of the flesh are the least bad of all sins. Now, that might sound wild, but it's the logical conclusion of his argument. The spiritual rot of pride and hatred is just a much bigger threat to your soul than the temptations of the body. But look, this doesn't mean Lewis thought sexual sin wasn't a big deal. He absolutely did. He just wanted to put it in its proper place. And to do that, he drew a line in the sand between two things we often mix up today: the Christian virtue of chastity and the social custom of propriety. So let's be super clear on what Lewis says the actual Christian rule is. He calls it the old Christian rule of chastity, and it's pretty simple. Either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner, or else total abstinence. For Lewis, this is the standard. It doesn't change. Okay, but here's the question Lewis forces us to ask. Is that timeless moral rule the same thing as what our culture at any given moment calls modesty or decency? And Lewis's answer is a hard no. They are not the same thing. This table breaks it down really well. Chastity is a moral rule that doesn't change. It's the same for all Christians, everywhere, all the time. It's about what we do and what we intend. Propriety, on the other hand, is just a social custom. It's about how you dress, what words you use, and that stuff changes all the time from one place to another. And Lewis really spells out what that difference means. He says if you break a social rule of propriety, say you dress in a way that's considered improper, you're only guilty of bad manners. That's it. It only becomes a sin against chastity if your motive was in order to excite lust. So just being improper doesn't automatically mean you're being unchaste. This, of course, brings up a really good question that Lewis tackles head on. Okay, if sex is a natural appetite, like hunger, why is the Christian rule of chastity so hard? Why does it feel so unnatural to us? Lewis's answer is pretty blunt. He says we're left with two options. Either the Christian teaching is wrong, or our sexual instinct itself has gone wrong. And as a Christian, he lands on the second option. He argues that our sexual instinct is not in its original healthy state. It's broken. To prove his point, he compares our appetite for sex to our appetite for food. Think about it. A glutton might eat enough for 2 people, maybe even 3, but he's not going to eat for 10. The appetite is a little out of whack. But sex? Lewis points out that if a man acted on his sexual appetite every time he felt it, in about 10 years he could easily populate a small village. The appetite, he says, is in a ridiculous excess of its biological function. Yeah, and he has this other great analogy. He asks, can you imagine filling up a theater to watch a server bring out a covered dish and then slowly lift the cover to reveal a mutton chop? Of course not. You'd think that country had a serious problem with its appetite for food.
And yet Lewis says that's exactly what a striptease is. For him, our culture's obsession with sex is a giant red flag that the instinct itself is malfunctioning.
So this all circles back to his main point. Lewis gives us a very clear hierarchy of sin. It's not like all sins are on the same level. He gives us a final verdict on what should really have our attention. This chart kind of shows the scale he's talking about. The diabolical sins, pride, hatred, the love of power, these are the lion's share of the problem. Sins of the flesh are definitely on the map. They're real sins, but they are a much smaller piece of the spiritual danger we're in. And this leads to maybe the most challenging thing Lewis ever wrote on the subject. It really pulls everything we've talked about together. He says, quote, "A cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. Why? Because that self-righteous person is swimming in the worst sins of all, the spiritual ones, while the prostitute is caught up in what Lewis called the least bad of all sins. And of course, he adds, it is much better to be neither." So we'll just leave you with this question to think about. If C.S. Lewis is right, if the worst sins really are spiritual, pride, spite, hatred, self-righteousness, what does that change about how you see your own heart? And what does it change about how you see other people? Thanks for joining this explainer.